The cold statistical balancing is finished, but the human story is not told. Tonight, Mr. Hoover will bring you that story. He has felt that it was his obligation to report firsthand to the people of the United States on the food situation as he has found it. Hundreds of people are gathered in Chicago to hear and see Mr. Hoover as he describes the condition he has seen in many parts of the world in recent weeks. Millions more, I know, are at their radios. Mr. Hoover, America is waiting to hear from you. Ladies and gentlemen, the Food Ambassador of the United States, the Honorable Herbert Hoover.
My fellow citizens who are interested in the saving of human life. And Mr. Secretary Anderson, I deeply appreciate your kind statement. But the American people should know that it is Secretary Anderson who is carrying the burden of the administrative measures for the United States in this crisis, and carrying that burden well and ably. He has the aid of such citizens as Mr. Clark and Mr. Sheldon and Mr. Davis and millions of devoted men and women. This tonight is my report to the American people upon the world famine situation. 3 weeks ago, I broadcasted from Cairo our report upon the situation in Europe. Since then, we have examined the food problems in Egypt, in Iraq, in India, and Siam, and the Philippines, China, Korea, and Japan. Thus, we have compassed most of Asia. I can therefore now consolidate our findings in 25 countries which we visited, and upon several more which we have received competent information. At the request of President Truman, I have acted as a sort of a food ambassador to determine the need, to discover possible further sources of supplies, to coordinate the world's effort to master the most gigantic danger to the lives of millions of people. Beyond this, it has been my duty to represent the solicitude of the American people and their desire to help. Along the 35,000 miles that we have traveled, I have seen with my own eyes the grimmest specter of famine in all the history of this world. Of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the one named war has gone, at least for a while. But famine and pestilence and death are still charging upon the earth. And the modern world has added 4 more to that evil brigade. Their names are destruction and drought and fear and revolution. And this crisis is not alone, therefore, due to war destruction of agriculture. On the top of that calamity is piled a drought in the Mediterranean, a drought in India, a drought in China, and a partial drought in South Africa and the Argentine. Never have so many evil horsemen come all at the same time. So that hunger hangs over the homes of more than 800 million people. That is over 1/3 of the people of the earth. And hunger is a silent visitor who comes like a shadow. He sits beside every anxious mother 3 times a day. He brings not alone suffering and sorrow, but fear and terror. He carries disorder and the paralysis of government, and even its downfall. He is more destructive than armies, not only in human life, but in morals. All of the values of right living melt before his invasion, and every gain of civilization crumbles. But we can save these people from that worst if we will. In our mission throughout Europe, I have had the devoted cooperation of 6 colleagues, all of whom had long experience in famines. We secured the independent investigations in advance of our coming. We consulted at length with the heads of states, with the food and agricultural experts of every government. We checked and cross-checked all information with American officials in those countries. We have checked it again with the relief organizations of many nationalities who are working closely with these stricken people. And above all, my colleagues and I have gone into the byways to see for ourselves. I am confident that our conclusions are close to a reality. On this journey, I have seen much that I could criticize as to the management of famine relief. I have criticized such matters to many officials in the world, frankly. I could criticize them bitterly. But after every boiling of inward indignation at men or at nations, I come back again and again to the fact that millions are in grave danger of starvation. And to explode into public criticism or controversy in this crisis would not only weaken the amount of support and diminish the food they will receive. Criticism can wait for history. I only want to record that all is not perfect in the world that I have witnessed. I mention it because it adds emphasis to the fact that today the vital need is unity and cooperation now, so that we may master this crisis. In appraising the world situation, I could give you reams of figures of rations and of calories and of tons of this and of that, and for every country and for every district. I could give you their stocks of food, the food in transit, and the further need of each famine area. I could give it to you by the month or by the crisis. I could give the time required to ship food, the details of ports and of railroads and trucks and capacity for distribution. This sort of detailed information would convey very little to you, but it is full of meaning in the lives of men and women and children to my colleagues and myself. For in these figures lurks the certainty of hunger to hundreds of millions and even the specter of mass starvation before this crisis is past. So rather than such details, time requires that I give you a global picture in the hope that it will convey to you the gravity of the situation and the need for our utmost further effort. I have said before that calories are the yardstick of hunger. They are the yardstick of starvation, of famine, and finally of death. And I may remind you that the average of 2,200 calories per day per person, while that's a technical expression, is the minimum in the nation for a healthy human being. And so do remember that we Americans, the British, the Canadians, the Australians, the Swedes, the Argentinians, and most of the Western Hemisphere are consuming over 2,900 calories per day right now. If these 800 million people should receive no more relief, if the stream of overseas supplies which has been flowing steadily to them should stop altogether, and if we assume that their own remaining resources could be evenly distributed, which they could not, the measure of their hunger with this caloric yardstick is about this. About 100 million people would be reduced to the 2,000 calorie level. About 100 million more people would be reduced to the 1,800 calorie level. About 150 million more would be reduced to the 1,500 calorie level. About 150 million more than all this would be reduced to the 1,200 calorie level, and about 300 million more would be reduced to 900 calories or less, and that is death. As we descend that scale, we move step by step from the stage of hunger to the stage of disease and epidemics, to the stage of public disorder, to the stage of starvation of all but the very strongest, and finally at 900 calories and below, we come to mass starvation. The Nazis at Buchenwald and at Belsen gave almost that amount to their prisoners. And long before a population is reduced to these lower levels, government will break down and the end has come. And these specters are only 30 days away in most of these famine areas, for that is the outside limit of their present overseas supplies. We must prevent the descent to these lower levels. Reconstruction and peace in the world will go up in flames of chaos if we fail. So the transcendent question is the available overseas supplies with which to fulfill this formula. To illustrate it, I will discuss the breadstuffs only, for they are the very symbols of life and hope. The problem of fats is no less urgent, but that would burden your minds with too many figures. And in breadstuffs, I want you to know that I include all human food cereals that are available. We have had two sources of breadstuff supply in this crisis. The first are the residues of the 1945 harvest in the surplus countries. And the second are the earlier part of the coming harvest of 1946. The harvest of some countries comes in June and others as late as October. And some supplies from the new harvest can be made available to the countries of late harvest. If the present harvest continue favorable, relief will come to the world in a few months. By September, new supplies should be generally available and this immediate crisis will end. In March last, the Combined Food Board in Washington, over which Mr. Anderson presides, made an estimate of the amount of food needed by all of the deficit nations for the first 6 months of 1946 and of the supplies available from the surplus food nations. These estimates of need were based on the requirements as stated by the various nations who must have overseas supplies. Adding into this estimate the need between June and the fall harvest, the total requirements of cereals were listed at roughly 26 million tons. And for the same period, the supplies were estimated at about 15 million tons. And thus there was apparently an unbridgeable gap of 11 million tons, or nearly 45%. That would be a calorie level below all human endurance to literally 500 or 600 millions of people. That gap of 11 million tons spelt death. During these past months, shipments have been moving. Mass starvation has so far been prevented. Now our mission examined the stocks in the hands of each country and the amounts of their own production that could be expected. We measured the needs of each nation on a drastic calorie basis, such as would pull them through, that would prevent mass starvation, that would maintain order and economic life. We kept the 1,500 to the 1,800 calorie bedrock figure always in mind. Most of the nations visited joined earnestly with us in working out the very minimum that they could do it, as they all realized the desperation of other nations. The net of these drastic revisions was to reduce the total world requirements of breadstuffs by about 4 million tons. By developing some new resources, by substitution of other cereals, by shifting between early and late harvest, by our own sacrifices in America, and by spreading this sacrifice in other surplus nations, we estimate supplies for the hungry will be increased by a minimum of about 3 million tons. And thus the gap has decreased from 11 million tons to about 3.5 million tons at the present time. But that gap is still there, and it is a tragic gap. I can perhaps illustrate how tragic it is. It equals the whole amount of food necessary to save 40 million lives in India. It would, of course, not be concentrated as a shortage on any one nation, but if we spread it over all, the result is just the same. There are Americans who believe it is right and a duty to feed women and children even of a surrendered enemy. For no one is the enemy of children. There are others who believe that the only hope of a peaceful world is to save the enemy peoples from starvation and thus start building them into peaceful, cooperative people. There are others who, remembering the immeasurable crimes the enemy has committed against all mankind, believe in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. To these, let me say that to keep 500,000 American boys in garrison among starving women and children is unthinkable. It is impossible, because being Americans, they will share their rations with hungry children. It is impossible because hunger brings total destruction to all morals. It is impossible because of the danger to American boys of sweeping infectious diseases which rise invariably from famine. It is unthinkable because we do not want our boys machine gunning famished rioters. And it is unthinkable because we do not want the American flag flying over a nationwide Buchan waltz. Therefore, we include the enemy country in our relief. And what of the children of Europe? This 1,500-calorie bottom level is dreadfully hard on children. It is hard because a large portion of the average ration of a nation must go to the heavy workers if essential services are to be kept going. And while this diet, which is as much as 85% bread and the balance a little fat, some sugar and vegetables will pull adults through, it is not adapted to children. Several nations give them priority in what little dairy supplies there are. Some extra food is given to children in schools. And the charitable agencies are doing the best they can. But in all, they are touching only the fringe of that problem. The proof that it is only the fringe they have touched is the annual infant mortality rate as high as 200 in 1,000 among children under 1 year in many European cities. The further proof is that there are somewhere from 20 to 30 million physically subnormal children on the continent. After the war of 1919-1920, we gave a good extra meal a day of 500 or 600 calories of restorative food to 10 million children. And I deplore that this special aid to children has no counterpart through a similar widespread organization set up after this war. Yet civilization marches forward on the feet of healthy children. It is not too late to stop this costly retreat and its debacle into endless evil. Much the same could be said of tens of millions of children in Asia. There are millions of those children that have been falling short of full life long before this famine. They are harder to reach and to help because of age-old rooted customs. Our mission has stimulated some action for children both in Europe and Asia. And I have already proposed elsewhere not alone a systematic handling of this problem of subnormal children, but a drastic reorganization of the whole world's food administration for the next harvest year. It is a primary job for the United Nations organization if peace and goodwill are to be reestablished on this earth. UNRWA, with its earnest staff, attends to about 20% only of the world's needs. Their supply is by charity in the sense that it is given to governments free. The large part of its cost comes from America. As great as its work is, 80% of the world's problem is not gifts to nations. It is the furnishing of supplies to nations who can buy, and who can pay for, and who are just as hungry as the destitute. There are some hopes of further decreasing this gap of 3,600,000 tons. It will largely depend upon the American people. First, we should have still more intensive conservation of breadstuffs and fats in the whole of North America. Before I went on this journey, we asked the American people to reduce their consumption of wheat products to 2 pounds per week per person and to cut their purchases of fats by 20%. That was a simple formula, Hundreds of thousands of families have responded by cutting out wheat products altogether, and public eating places in many cities have cooperated finally. I regret to say there are too many who have not yet cooperated with some human being abroad. I earnestly hope that every American will remember that an invisible guest sits with him at every meal. When I recollect the faces of villagers whose food supply for a whole day was 1 cupful of wheat, I get a satisfaction in eating no wheat bread or wheat products whatever. That is easier regime for me than many Americans, perhaps because I was raised where the tall corn grows. We can succeed, if we can succeed in persuading every man and woman and every nation to do its utmost, we will master this famine, and we shall save the lives of hundreds of millions from jeopardy, and more than a greater jeopardy in the whole history of mankind. We shall save infinite human suffering. We are seeking still further cooperation of other nations. The Latin American states have responded to our appeals and to those of Pope Pius XII for cooperation. At President Truman's request, I shall visit these governments to consult with them on further measures of coordination of our efforts. Now, I was asked by the President to undertake this journey purely as an advisory capacity, and with the further journey to Latin America, my service must largely end. The responsibilities of administration of the programs which I have outlined lie with our officials, and I bespeak for them the full support of all Americans in their efforts to meet this tremendous world crisis. Before I end, I should pay tribute to my colleagues on this journey and to the great army of men and women of every nation in the world working unceasingly to save these millions of lives. The voluntary organizations of religious bodies, the Red Cross of many nations, they are all in the field, unceasingly doing their best, but they can only remedy a fraction of this suffering. In conclusion, do I need to reinforce this report with a more urging to do your utmost? I may repeat again what I said 3 weeks ago from Cairo. If every source of supplies will do its utmost, we can pull the world through this most dangerous crisis. The saving of these human lives is far more than an economic necessity to the recovery of the world. It is more than the only path to order, or the only path to stability and to peace, because such action marks the return of the lamp of compassion on this earth, and that is a part of the moral and the spiritual reconstruction of the world. Thank you.